Welcome to Conversatorio Cubano, Professor Raquel Otheguy. We are really delighted to have you, who are the author of our very first in the series, Caribbean Crossroads, published by the University of Florida Press. And the book is also your first book. The book is called Black Freedom and Education in 19th-Century Cuba. So congratulations on the book, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here talking to such a preeminent scholar of Cuba. And I'm also honored that my book, Black Freedom and Education in 19th-Century Cuba, was published as part of this incredible Caribbean Crossroads series that I'm so excited about. So thank you.
Well, the book is very original, and it excavates a history that has previously really not been documented. And in many respects, it's the history of education, but it's also the history of education as a lens onto the wider Cuban society of the 19th century. So one of the key struggles is surely the struggle against and for racial desegregation of schools. So I want to note, for those of us who are historians and perhaps those who are not historians, that most books on 19th century Cuba have tended to focus on slavery, on the abolition movements against slavery, as well as Cuba's struggles for independence. And so this book's angle and perspective is very unique, and it opens a window onto a past with which we are pretty much unfamiliar. So I wonder if you could put together for us this kind of more traditional approach to 19th century Cuba, which is to study slavery and to study the abolitionist movements and the independence wars or the independence struggles, with this history of schools and education in Cuba that you have so deftly provided.
Great, thank you. The book definitely, the context for the book and the context for the story in the book is certainly the incredible 19th century struggles in Cuba against slavery, against colonialism. You can't escape that when you're working on 19th century Cuba, and we shouldn't escape it. Those are important struggles that are not by any means resolved struggles, right, in the present. The struggle against monarchical rule, the struggle against colonialism, the struggle against slavery, racism. These are not done battles, and so we have to continue to look at how Cubans, struggled against these things in the 19th century. The reason I focus on education is because, first of all, across certainly the Americas, people of African descent understood education to be part of or a continuation of the struggle against slavery and racism, right? Slavery, after all, is but one way to control a racialized population, right? And once slavery is under attack or no longer exists, and depending on where in the Americas you're talking about, education becomes a crucial site where the elites, the people in control of the nation, that whatever context you're talking about. In the case of Cuba, both colonial elites and Creole elites who were maybe fighting against colonialism, all of these people in power saw educational systems as a tool that they could use to control the population in general, but certainly in the Afro-descended population, which in the Caribbean is a large part of the population, right? So in some ways I focus on education because it's there. If you look at the archive, it's there. It's something that people in power were interested in using as a tool of oppression. At the same time, when I first, when I was a young graduate student and I sort of wanted to think about Black sort of civil rights movements in Cuba, and I looked at your work, Ada Ferrer's work, Oilda Lanier's work, Philip Howard's work. They sort of pointed me towards the late 19th century struggles for civil rights, among Afro-descended people in Cuba. Like the Directorio Central de las Sociedades de Color, or de la Raza de Color, And the first time I went to the archive and I opened those documents, I was like, oh my gosh, all they talk about is education, right? And so I think sometimes for historians, history of education is kind of a niche field. But I always, protest against that because people of color themselves, Afro-descended people in Cuba and in lots of other places in the Americas, were insisting on the centrality of education. And that juxtaposition, the fact that education was both a site of oppression by people in power, especially colonial elites in Cuba, and not colonial, and the Creole elites in Cuba, and U.S. authorities in the United States. You can look at different contexts. That it was both a tool of oppression, but also it was a ground that Afro-descended people and working class people refused to cede, right? It's not like, okay, well, they're using that as a tool of oppression, so we're going to do something else. No, they stay in the field of education and they struggle in the field of education. And I think that tells us something important. I think that tells us that, I was talking to a colleague about having to do book talks, and she said, you just tell them education is emancipation and literacy is liberation. I just love her alliteration there. Yeah. But it's true, right? Education, there's something about education, and especially literacy. And my book is in large part about primary education, right? So education of little children, that is emancipatory, that is liberating. And that I want to honor my historical protagonists, and for those of us who are Cuban, our antepasados, right? By noting that education was an important field for them, an important field when it came to the struggle for freedom, and so that's why I wrote the book about education.
Okay. So one of the key, most fascinating parts of your story focuses on Black Cubans' efforts to create cultural and economic and political autonomy. So Black teachers, Black female teachers, for instance, are major protagonists in your work. And I wonder if you could explain why such an effort? What was the need among Black Cubans in the 19th century to establish autonomy from white patronage? I think, especially in the context of the mid-19th century, which, again, is a period defined by slavery and the atrocities that involved in terms of daily basis for Cubans who were enslaved and for Cubans who were not enslaved, and for Africans who might have even been recent arrivals. So the protagonists of chapters 5 and 6 are Black Cubans really working for this kind of autonomy. I wonder if you could explain why they needed to seek this autonomy and what was the role of some of these protagonists, like the Black female teachers.
Yeah, thank you. So when I started doing this research, I was very interested in the struggle for racial desegregation of the schools, right? So in my mind, it was framed as a integrationist battle, right? That people of color wanted to be integrated into wider Cuban society. And I think that's true, that was occurring. And it was occurring in a context of de jure segregation, right? So that educational laws in colonial Cuba had actually mandated racial segregation, right? And sometimes we think of Latin America and the myth of racial democracy, and we think, well, people of color were struggling against something different than Americans, African Americans who are struggling against Jim Crow, where it was really de jure segregation. It's true that the situation in Cuba was not the same, but there were laws that mandated segregation, right? And so certainly Afro-descended people, Blacks and mulattoes, are fighting against that for integration. That is happening. But the more I sort of dug into the story, the more I realized that there were all these spaces where Afro-descended people were also creating their own educational opportunities. One of them is in the sociedades de color, right? These mutual aid societies that are that come out of the cofradías, the cabildos de nación. There was a very long tradition of African ethnic organizations, of sort of lay organizations or confraternities that were sanctioned by the Catholic Church, by the Cuban state, as you know. Out of that grows in the late 19th centuries these mutual aid societies. In part, they have to kind of some of them have to sort of rearrange themselves to fit into the new regulations that govern these things. So we get all these mutual aid societies, and there's a lot of schools in these mutual aid societies. And again, in part, I suspected at first that this was in part because the regulations wanted these mutual aid societies to be coded as sociedades de instrucción y recreo. And so at first I was like, well, maybe they weren't really educational societies, but they just kind of said they were because that's what the regulations wanted, right? But no, I mean, the nice thing about regulations is that they leave records. And, you look at these records, and in fact, they did have schools. Now, sadly, for historians of education, I don't have like curricular records, which is too bad. But certainly all of the reglamentos, the kind of bylaws and constitutions of these schools and the mutual aid societies exist, right? And they show that these were really important areas for people of color to organize separately, right? And so I think that this has to do with certainly by the late 19th century, these are spaces that are refuges from the intensifying white supremacy that has been intensifying throughout the 19th century as attacks on slavery have become have heated up. And as slave rebellions have heated up in the 19th century, right? In other words, slavery is more and more and more under attack. White supremacy is, and racial discrimination is increasing, and racial just outright oppression and violence are increasing over the course of the 19th century, right? So by the end of the 19th century, certainly you need sort of these spaces. I also think when we think about education, it's important to think about what separate schools for Black children are doing, right? Which is that they are allowing children to have spaces to learn without the white supremacist ideas that underpin the education system. And so, I think it's important to have that spaces. It also employs Black teachers, right? And this is one of the things that is paradoxical about the fight for racial integration of schools. Again, not only in Cuba, but you also see this in the United States, is that the more you get racial integration, although it's been highly unsuccessful, right, in the United States, but in those moments where you get more racial integration of the schools, you get Black children being taught by white teachers, right? And you get Black teachers losing their jobs. And so Black teachers losing their jobs means that people don't have employment, but also Black children being taught by white teachers in a white supremacist context can be a problem, right? So the schools, the Black schools, the racially separate schools in the sociedades de color provide a refuge from that. They provide employment from teachers. It also but I do want to say, right, that what's really interesting about what I found in the book, and I can give a few more examples, right, is that for the Afro-descendants who are engaged in these educational struggles that I narrate in the book, it's always both. It's not one or the other. They're not doing either racial integration or racially separatist organizing. They're doing both, right? And I find that to be really powerful, right? So the schools in the sociedades de color, at the same time, they were for Black students. They allowed students from, the membership fees for the mutual aid society already paid for the children to go to school, so they didn't have to pay additional fees for children to go to school at a time where there was no tuition-free education, right? So they allow sometimes children from other mutual aid societies to also go to their school. So it's certainly sort of a Black and mulatto space. However, sometimes they also allow white children to enter the school, right? And so they're all, you always see kind of both the attention to racial integration of Cuban society and insistence that Cuban society cannot just exclude Blacks and mulattoes, but also an insistence on these spaces that can nurture Black communities.
Black pride and knowledge of Blacks as sources of knowledge in and of themselves.
Yeah, totally. And, by the end of the 19th century, a lot of the leaders of educational kind of movements are more from the Black middle class and more bourgeois. There's more of a racial uplift approach, which does mean that sometimes there's a sort of anti-African bias, right? We're going to take on, we as the Black middle class that is leading the Black masses out of slavery, we are going to take on the white sort of European bourgeois cultural norms as a way to prove our fitness for this society, which in some ways is a really powerful refutation of white supremacist ideology that says that these people can't do the thing. But on the other hand, is really problematic in its anti-Black and anti-African, especially bias, right? You see that a little bit less with some of the characters that I talk about at the beginning of the 19th century. So at the beginning of the 19th century, I have a chapter on these Black and mulatto militiamen, right? Cuba allowed for these militias. Cuba had the Spanish colonial government in Cuba had standing militias, but they were racially segregated. So there were white militias, Black militias, mulatto militias. Sometimes the Black and mulatto militias were combined, depending on the city. And I learned this from Pedro de Champchapeau, right? There are many, and I have a chapter on it. It needs to be further excavated, right? But there are many militiamen who become teachers, right? So that's very much in some ways, these people are doing both things. They are sort of members of the Spanish colonial state. If you're a militiaman, you are being recognized by the Spanish colonial state. You are being given special rights that extend to your community, the fuero militar. So very much in sort of an integrationist kind of way of being with the Spanish colonial state. But then they would create separate Black schools, right, for Black children. In part, I argue to set kind of, I say that a lot of the Black teachers are doing this. I borrow this from the African American context, but lifting while they climbed, right? So just like Black militiamen were used to extending the rights that they got from the Spanish colonial state to their community in terms of the fuero militar and other benefits that their community got from having so many Black men participate in the militias. So too are they doing that with literacy, right? So many Black militiamen who are used to, royal decrees mattering, right? Or travel. And so understand the role of literacy in sort of geopolitics. They travel to fight, wars and things, battles. Those people who are gaining literacy are then extending it to the community, to their Black community in these racially separate schools. So it's kind of both, right? You see this like simultaneous move. I also think those men are amazing and interesting because some Black militiamen who become teachers also rebel. So on the one hand, they're asking for licenses to teach from the Spanish colonial government. They're creating separate Black schools for children, and then they're rebelling against the Spanish colonial government. So it really covers the spread of racial integration or racially separatist organizing. But, maybe my favorite historical characters are the maestras amigas, who are the subject of the first chapter of the book and who I love. And I also think that there needs to be a lot more research on the maestras amigas because they do continue well into the 20th century and probably into the 21st.
Tell us who they are.
Yes, thank you. So the maestras amigas, it's a term for women who taught young children in their homes. And the schools that they had in their homes were called escuelitas de casa or escuelitas de amigas. Now, this is a phenomenon that happens in lots of places, right? It's a phenomenon that you see happening in Cuba, in Puerto Rico. You see it happening in Spain. You also see kind of versions of this in the British colonies. So in the British Northeast, there's like dame schools that are similar to this. And then certainly the escuelita phenomenon certainly exists in Mexico and the U.S. Southwest a little bit later than the period I'm talking about. But, again, perhaps research needs to be done there about how far back that goes. So it's a widespread phenomenon. But in Cuba, it was very, very common. And these are women who would just sort of take the children from the neighborhood. And, again, young children. They would teach them what was called primeras letras, right? Which is kind of the equivalent to the American 3 R's, the reading, writing, arithmetic, which sometimes was the 4 R's, even in the North American context, included religion, right? So in the escuelitas de amigas, these women would teach reading, writing, and catechism probably, right? Most of those women throughout various periods of the 19th century are women of color. And we know that because the liberal education reformers wrote about them because they hated them, right? They just disdained them. But it's been a really wonderful and fun sort of archival reading exercise, right? Because in fact, most of what I learned about the Maestras Amigas was through the records of these men that hated them and that were racist and that were sexist, right? Total misogynists. So these women, we don't know. Well, I'll tell you what we do know. We know that they were teaching children to read and write, and we don't know what religion they were teaching them. I suspect, based on the vitriol and on the suspicion of what the Creole reformers have left behind, that they were concerned that they were teaching them maybe the wrong religious maxims, maybe West African or syncretic sort of West African religious maxims. We know that they taught them to read because the Creole reformers of education, the white men in charge of education in the early 19th century, they say things like, oh, in these schools that are run by ex-slaves, these, the children, they only learn to read, right? Oh my gosh, what do you mean they only learn to read? Like, learning to read, that's the ball game, right? Literacy is a huge accomplishment, especially for people who are coming out of slavery, right? Especially for formerly enslaved people, especially for people dealing with racism. For all children, literacy is a big deal. So again, these women also they're mostly women of color. They're operating they're not licensed. They're operating outside of the colonial system. So again, it tends to be like a separate space, a racially separate space. But they often include white children in their schools as well, right? So you have this like Black magisterio, right? This teaching force that is Afro-descended women mostly. And yet they are also including white children, right? So again, you have that duality of racial integration is happening or like pushes for racial integration or pushes for being acknowledged by the wider nation or the wider state are combined with the need for racially separate spaces where you can protect children from white supremacy and where you can do that thing that goes, one of the major underpinnings of white supremacy in the 19th century is that Black children are incapable of, fill in the blanks. Reading is one of them, right? Reading, learning, that Latino people are incapable of self-government. It's the incapability myth that undergirds much of white supremacy in the 19th and 20th centuries, right? And so teaching them how to read takes away the justification for white supremacy. Of course, it doesn't solve the problem, right? But it's a big move against white supremacy.
Yeah,
against the logic.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge, and then the evidence is immediately produced that it's based on a falsehood. I also think you leave the door open for these women to have been just simply allowing young Cubans to interpret the Bible for themselves. My God, can you imagine? Even just doing that as a female would have gone contrary to the Catholic theological position at the time. And so leaving just that door open to the possibility that learning to read or that discussing theological texts, which would have been somewhat available, that was one of the things that made them so much a threat and made them the subject of so much demonization. I think that there is that possibility, and your book leaves that door open to interpretation.
I think that, one of the things, history of education scholarship usually is like rife with kind of curricular documents, student documents, all of these things. And so when I first started doing this work, a lot of history of education scholars would tell me like, oh, but you don't know what they were teaching, right? And in the book, I make an argument that when we know what they were doing and what people are complaining about what they're doing, that can tell you a little bit about their ideology, about these teachers' ideologies. But also, it has been nice to leave that door open, right? It has been nice to sit with the uncertainty or the inability to know for certain what these women were teaching, but to kind of piece together some clues based on what other people were saying about what they were teaching and what we know that they were doing in their schools, who they had in their schools and things like that. Their sort of praxis, not their curriculum, but their praxis, right? It has forced me in a way that I was initially frustrated by, but have now found very fruitful to like sit with the idea of what could they have been teaching based on, and of course making educated sort of conclusions, but what could they have been teaching? And not being able to like know for sure has really opened up the door to, I think, a lot of really productive sort of speculation about that.
Mhm. Well, a lot of people don't normally identify Cuba as a site of Blackness. And I would say, too, that often Cuban is not even seen as having been defined by slavery or by the experience of the enslaved. And yet anyone who knows anything about Cuba, certainly our own students and my experience here in the state of Florida, they almost immediately realize just how absurd that myth is, because the history is so obviously in contradiction to that myth. So Cuba is a place that is defined by slavery. It is defined in many respects by Black freedom struggles, and your book, Black freedom struggles, in general, is its purpose, is the analysis of that, the excavation of that, the exploration of what the implications for these actions and these stories might be long term over the course of a whole century. So I wonder, if you could just simply comment on what you think the lessons might be for people today, looking back and saying, well, why do we need to know about Black freedom and education in Cuba in the 19th century? What can be learned from that history? What do you think can be learned from this history?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to say that I think that my book is a hopeful narrative, and in some ways that's a matter of framing. But I do think I have learned a lot from my historical, sort of subjects of study. And one is to not abandon the field, right? Especially the field of education, right? So that education is an area, an arena that is a site of struggle. And just because people in power want to use education to be oppressive and controlling spaces does not mean that we cannot use it as that, all of us cannot use it as sites of liberation and possibility and freedom from racism and class oppression. Because that's what these people did. They did not give up on education. They did not give up on literacy. They did not give up on their right to teach their children to read and write. And so that's one, very important lesson that's very relevant today as, teachers are being told what they can and cannot teach about race, about Black history, about Latino history, about, LGBTQ people, all the things, right? As the Department of Education is slashed. So education is always a place where those who seek to oppress us are going to try to use it, and we cannot abandon the field. We will insist on a more liberatory education. I also think that the book does show sort of the limits of liberal nationalism, right? When you do 19th century Cuba, the Spanish colonial government is the bad guy, right? For all of us in the Americas, right? The Spanish colonial government, the colonial governments are the bad guys, and the Republican governments, disque that came after are the good guys. But, the white liberal Creole people who were involved in anti-colonial struggle were themselves also people who believed very much in white supremacy and who were trying to sort of keep the maestras amigas out and ensuring racial segregation in the school system, right? So what the book shows is that both colonial officials and Creole means born in Cuba, for those of you who are not familiar with Cuba or Latin America, that both colonial Spanish officials and Creole officials or reformers were interested in propping up white supremacy and oppressing and Black people through education. The limits. So there are limits to the sort of liberal nationalist model, right? But this is also a place that was not abandoned by Afro-descended Cubans, right? So Juan Gualberto Gómez is who is the head of the Directorio Central de las Sociedades de la Raza de Color. He is, fighting against he's fighting against school segregation. He's negotiating with the Spanish colonial government to do that, while he's also involved in Cuban autonomist or nationalist struggles, and while he's creating separate Black spaces for children. So, he's like an example of somebody who does all the things. So again, none of these areas of debate or struggle are purely the thing, right? None of them are purely good. None of them are purely liberatory. And we have to know that. We have to know the dangers and the sites of oppression. But also we have to know that our antepasados did not mean that they were not going to be on those sites of struggles or be in those sites of struggles.
Yeah, the complexity, the pluralism, the search for both of those things constantly, those are major lessons of this book. And also the reminder that so much of who we are today rests on who we were in the past and how we were as Cubans. Our ancestors were from all walks of life. And that I think the book embraces multiple entry points to this idea by the end of the 19th century of liberation for all through anti-colonialism, not just through the abolition of slavery, but beyond that, what are we going to do? So your protagonists are, especially the Black female teachers, to me are sort of new heroes of Cuba. And I really want to thank you for contributing this wonderful book. It's Black Freedom and Education in 19th Century Cuba. And thank you for publishing with the University of Florida Press.
Thank you.